For years, Liberia's civil war was a battlefield of unimaginable horror. Warlords ruled with blood-soaked hands, child soldiers fought high on drugs, and entire villages disappeared overnight. But among all the brutality, one name stood out from the rest. This is the story of a man whose soldiers fought completely naked, believing they were immune to bullets. A warlord who didn't just kill his enemies, but sacrificed them. A man so feared, so ruthless, that even other warlords spoke his name in whispers. This is the story of General Butt Naked, the most horrific warlord in history. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss more stories from the darkest corners of history. There are wars that change borders, there are wars that change governments, and then there are wars that change the soul of a country forever. For Liberia, the first civil war wasn't just a conflict, it was a descent into madness, a time when neighbors turned on neighbors, when warlords ruled with blood-soaked hands, and when the streets were littered with bodies instead of fallen leaves. From 1989 to 1997, Liberia became hell on earth. By the time the war was over, more than 200,000 people were dead, and an entire generation was left with scars that would never heal. But how did this happen? How did an entire country collapse into such unimaginable horror? To understand, we have to go back to where it all began. It started with one man, Samuel Doe. For most of Liberia's history, the country had been ruled by Americo-Liberians, the descendants of freed African-American slaves who founded Liberia in 1847. They held power for over a century, treating the indigenous tribes as second-class citizens, ruling with corruption and privilege. But in 1980, everything changed. Samuel Doe, a young military officer, led a violent coup against Liberia's government. The president, William Talbot, was murdered in his bed, and Doe's men executed 13 high-ranking officials, lining them up on a beach and shooting them one by one as crowds watched. At first, the people celebrated. For the first time, Liberia was ruled by a native African, not the elite Americo-Liberians. But the celebrations didn't last long. Power corrupted Doe instantly. He ruled with an iron fist, crushing opposition, torturing enemies, and filling the government with his own ethnic group, the Kran. Elections? Rigged. Dissent? Punished with death. And the country? Spiraling into chaos. And while Doe lived in luxury, Liberia's people suffered. Corruption ran so deep that even the military didn't get paid. The country was a ticking time bomb, waiting for someone to light the fuse. That man was Charles Taylor. On Christmas Eve 1989, Taylor crossed into Liberia with 100 men. It seemed laughable at first, 100 rebels against an entire national army. But Taylor wasn't just any rebel leader. He had spent years building his army, recruiting Liberian exiles, smuggling weapons, and gathering support from foreign backers. Many of his fighters were from the Geo and Mano ethnic groups who had suffered under Doe's rule. They weren't just fighting for power, they were fighting for revenge. Taylor's group called itself the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, but there was nothing patriotic about what came next. As Taylor's forces marched through the countryside, they burned villages, slaughtered civilians, and executed government soldiers. But Doe's army, the Armed Forces of Liberia, fought back in the only way they knew how, brutally. They didn't just target the rebels, they targeted everyone. Entire communities were wiped out simply because they shared the same ethnic background as the rebels. And suddenly, the war wasn't just about politics anymore. It became about tribes. Within months, the country descended into ethnic violence on an unimaginable scale. The Kran, loyal to Doe, fought against the Geo and Mano, loyal to Taylor. In between, thousands of innocent civilians were trapped, hunted down by both sides, butchered in churches, homes, and schools. By 1990, Liberia was unrecognizable. Refugees flooded into neighboring countries, running from mass executions, gang rapes, and forced child soldier recruitment. And as the government collapsed, warlords emerged, each one carving out their own territory, ruling like medieval kings. Some of them became infamous for their brutality, leading death squads and committing war crimes so horrific they defy belief. And among them, one name would go down in history as the most terrifying of them all. A warlord so ruthless, so bloodthirsty, that even the other killers feared him. He didn't wear body armor, he didn't carry shields, he didn't even wear clothes. They called him General Butt Naked. Some men become monsters because of war. Some men become monsters because of power. And some, they were never men to begin with. By the time Joshua Milton Blahyi picked up a gun, he had already done things that would haunt the nightmares of even the most ruthless warlords. But he did not start as a warlord. Before he became General Butt Naked, before he led child soldiers into battle, and before he terrorized the streets of Monrovia, he was something else entirely, something darker. His journey into violence did not begin with a gun. It began with an altar. Joshua was born in 1971 in Monrovia, Liberia, into the Kran ethnic group. In many ways, his early life was dictated by forces beyond his control. His people, the Kran, had risen to power after Samuel Doe's coup in 1980. And with that power came privilege, but also responsibility. The Kran had deep-rooted spiritual traditions, and Joshua was not raised as an ordinary child. From the moment he was born, he was destined for something different. At just 7 years old, his father made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Believing in the traditions of their ancestors, he handed his son over to the tribal elders, a move that was considered a great honor. The elders did not see Joshua as an ordinary boy. They saw him as someone chosen by the spirits, someone who would serve as a bridge between the world of the living and the dead. By the time he was 11, the process of his transformation was complete. He was taken deep into the wilderness, away from his family, away from civilization, and subjected to a brutal initiation ritual. There, in an isolated clearing, he was officially ordained as a high priest. But this was not a role of peace or wisdom. It was a role that demanded blood. As part of his initiation, Blahyi was given a task that would mark his passage into the spiritual world. He had to perform a human sacrifice. His victim was a child, another boy, no older than himself. The elders surrounded him, chanting in the flickering firelight, urging him forward. He later claimed that he hesitated at first, but the spirits guided his hand. He did what was expected of him. He took the life of another, and in doing so, sealed his fate. This was just the beginning. As the years passed, Joshua embraced his role fully. He claimed that the spirits spoke to him in visions, telling him who needed to die. When they did, there was no room for doubt. He would send the village elders to the victim's home, have them dragged from their beds and sacrifice them at the altar. According to his own testimony, he did not merely kill, he dismembered, drank blood, and consumed human flesh as part of the rituals. He believed that these acts gave him supernatural power, and that they made him stronger, faster, and untouchable. For years, this was his existence. He was not a soldier nor a rebel. He was something else, something far more terrifying. A man who killed not for politics, not for survival, but for ritual and belief. He served a power that could not be seen, only feared. Then, in 1989, the war came. Joshua could have remained in the shadows, continuing his rituals far from the gunfire, but the spirits he served demanded more. War, after all, was the greatest offering of all, and so he picked up a gun and entered the conflict. It was here, on the front lines of Liberia's bloody civil war, that he would transform once again. No longer a hidden priest, no longer a figure of whispered fear in the villages, he would become a warlord. And not just any warlord. He would become General Butt Naked. By 1991, Liberia had collapsed into absolute chaos. The country was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. Warlords ruled over burned-out villages, child soldiers roamed the streets with machine guns too heavy for their small bodies, and civilians lived in constant terror, knowing that death could come from any direction at any time. The war was no longer just about Charles Taylor and Samuel Doe. It had devolved into something far more monstrous, a free-for-all of violence, fueled by tribal hatred, greed, and an unrelenting thirst for power. Amid this brutality, Joshua Milton Blahyi was reborn once again. The high priest, who once killed in the shadows, now stepped fully into the light, not as a spiritual leader, but as a warlord. He aligned himself with the ULIMO, the United Liberation Movement of Liberia for Democracy, a militia formed by Kran and Mandinka fighters, many of whom were former soldiers from Doe's crumbling regime. Their mission was simple: wipe out Charles Taylor's forces. But in Liberia's war, there was no such thing as a just cause. There were no heroes, only killers. Blahyi, however, was no ordinary commander. His army would not be like the others. Blahyi's unit became the most feared in the entire war. They were known as the Naked Base Commandos. The name wasn't just for intimidation, it was literal. His soldiers went into battle completely naked, wearing nothing but combat boots and amulets they believed made them immune to bullets. Blahyi himself led them this way, sprinting through the streets of Monrovia without a single piece of armor or clothing. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To his followers, it was power. Blahyi claimed that the spirits had told him that clothing made warriors weak, and that true strength came from fighting in the raw, embracing the spirits, and trusting in their perfection. But superstition was not the only thing that had fueled them. Most of his soldiers were not men, they were children. Boys as young as 9 and 10 years old were pulled from their homes, given weapons, and forced into the army. But they were not just given guns. They were given something far worse: drugs. Before the battle, Blahyi's men fed his child soldiers a mixture of gunpowder and cocaine, sometimes laced with heroin, turning them into fearless, unthinking killers. They were taught to kill without hesitation, to execute prisoners with a smile, and to laugh while burning homes and hacking off limbs. For them, war was entertainment, and Blahyi encouraged it. He gave them names strange and absurd to strip away their humanity: Chuck Norris, Rambo, Terminator, Small Satan. And as they ran through the streets naked, high and laughing, their commander marched at the front, leading them into unimaginable horror. Blahyi fought for rituals. Before every major assault, he demanded a human sacrifice. His soldiers would bring him a victim, a pregnant woman, a baby, or a young child, and he would kill them in front of his men. He believed this made them unstoppable. One by one, the sacrifices bled out on his altar, the bodies ripped apart as his soldiers watched, waiting for their blessing. Then they went into battle, screaming, high, and covered in blood. And wherever they went, they left nothing but death behind. But for Blahyi, it was not enough to kill. He had to consume. He and his men did not just murder their victims, they ate them. After battles, they would cut open the dead, tearing out hearts, livers, and flesh, roasting them over fires or eating them raw. Blahyi claimed that eating human hearts made him stronger, that it gave him power over death itself. His soldiers followed his example, devouring the bodies of their enemies, believing it would make them invincible, and so the streets of Liberia were filled with bones. By 1993, Blahyi's name had become one of the most feared in the entire war. Even other warlords feared him. He was not the most powerful, he did not have the largest army, but what he had was madness, the kind that knew no limits. His men fought with no fear, no hesitation, and no mercy. And the worst of all, he wasn't finished yet. By 1996, Liberia was already in ruins. The first civil war had been raging for 7 years. The capital city, Monrovia, was barely standing. What was once a thriving metropolis had turned into a war zone of shattered buildings, blood-stained streets, and the constant sound of gunfire. There were no rules anymore, no safe zones, no civilians, no mercy. The war had become a battle of survival, fought between warlords who only knew how to kill. And on April 6, 1996, Monrovia experienced one of its darkest days yet. The streets, already soaked in blood, erupted into pure chaos as rival factions clashed for control of the city. It was a massacre. It all started with an attempt to arrest ULIMO leader Roosevelt Johnson, one of the most powerful warlords in the city. Charles Taylor's forces, alongside the government-backed militias, moved in to take him down. But Johnson wasn't going down without a fight. His fighters, including general butt-naked soldiers, fought back with everything they had. Within hours, the streets turned into a war zone. Monrovia became a battlefield of machine guns, rocket launchers, and machetes. Bullets flew in every direction. Explosions ripped through the city. Entire neighborhoods were set on fire. Bodies lay in the streets, rotting in the tropical heat, as soldiers fought from building to building, house to house, block by block. Civilians caught in the crossfire had nowhere to run. Families huddled inside their homes, praying the gunmen would pass them by, but there was no escaping the violence. By the time night fell, half of Monrovia's population had been displaced. Tens of thousands had fled towards the coast, trying to escape the city, but there was nowhere left to go. The war had swallowed everything. And in the middle of it all, one man stood above the carnage. As Monrovia burned, General Butt Naked made his presence known. Witnesses saw him standing on the back of a truck, completely naked, his body slick with sweat and blood. In one hand, he held an AK-47, still smoking from recent gunfire. In the other were a severed man's genitals. He waved it in the air like a trophy, laughing as his child soldiers danced around him, high on drugs, their faces twisted in madness. The sight was so horrifying, so surreal, that even battle-hardened soldiers paused in shock. Blahyi had always fought without limits, but now he was a living nightmare, a man who seemed to revel in the destruction, as if the war itself was his personal ritual. Later, when asked about that day, Blahyi made a staggering claim. By that point in the war, he said, he had personally killed at least 20,000 people. The number was impossible to verify. There were no records, no lists of names. But in a war where massacres happened daily, where bodies were left to rot in the streets, who was counting? But for the people of Liberia, the number didn't matter. They had seen the bodies, they had witnessed the executions, the child sacrifices, the mass graves. They knew what he had done. For years, Blahyi had lived by one rule: kill or be killed. He had bathed in blood, feasted on human flesh, and led his soldiers into battles without a second thought. He believed he was untouchable, a man protected by dark spirits, a warlord who feared nothing. But on that night, something changed. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Not his soldiers, not his enemies, not even himself. Because the devil's favorite warlord was about to claim he had seen something far more terrifying than war. He claimed he had seen God. Joshua would later claim that Jesus appeared to him in the middle of a battle. Not in a church, not in the quiet of the night, but right there on the battlefield, surrounded by blood and death. He described it as a vision unlike anything he had ever experienced. A man shining brighter than the sun stood before him. The figure didn't shout, didn't threaten him, didn't raise a weapon, but what it said shook Blahyi to his core. Repent and live, or refuse and die. Blahyi had spent his entire life believing he was invincible. He had walked into bullets and come out alive. He had fought naked, unprotected, and survived. He had killed men with his bare hands and felt no fear, but this terrified him. He would later say that in that moment he knew he wasn't the one in control. For the first time, he felt something he had never felt before: judgment. He believed that if he ignored the vision, if he continued down the path he was on, he would die, not just physically, but eternally. And so, in an instant, General Butt Naked was gone. No one saw it coming. One moment he was a warlord drenched in blood, the next he had dropped his weapons, abandoned his army and disappeared. He fled Monrovia, he fled Liberia, he ran from everything he had built, from the soldiers who had once followed him without question, from the ghosts of the men, women and children he had slaughtered. He was no longer the predator, he was running for his life. For years he vanished. The name General Butt Naked faded from the war, from the streets, from the whispered fears of those who had once prayed to escape him. People assumed he was dead, but he wasn't. He was changing. When Blahyi resurfaced years later, it wasn't with a gun in his hands. It was with a Bible. The warlord had transformed himself into an evangelical preacher, claiming that he had been saved by Jesus Christ. The man who once ordered child sacrifices now spoke of forgiveness and redemption. The man who had once cannibalized his victims now preached about salvation. No one knew what to make of it. Was this real? Was this a trick? Was he just trying to escape justice? Blahyi didn't just preach in churches, he went back to the streets, to the places where his soldiers had once executed prisoners, to the slums filled with children he had turned into killers. He did something no one expected. He asked for forgiveness. Blahyi didn't hide from his past, he didn't deny what he had done. He confessed, publicly, repeatedly, and in graphic detail. He told anyone who would listen about the horrors he had committed. He spoke to the families of his victims, falling to his knees, begging them to forgive him. Some did, some couldn't. He sought out the child soldiers he had once commanded, many of whom were now grown men, broken, traumatized, lost. He took them in, offering them shelter, support, and a chance at a new life. Some believed him, others refused. The world had seen war criminals' fake redemption before. Liberia had been filled with men who switched sides, who claimed to have changed but still held on to power, onto money, onto control. Was Blahyi different? Well, that question haunted everyone who met him. Blahyi's transformation was too radical to ignore. The world had known him as a monster, a man whose name had been spoken in fear. Now he called himself a man of God. Some believe he's a changed man, a walking example of forgiveness and transformation. Others see a manipulator, a man who swapped his weapons for a Bible but still knows how to control a crowd. And now we turn to you. What do you think? Can a man like Joshua Blahyi, a man who butchered, tortured, and terrorized an entire nation, ever truly be redeemed? Can someone like him simply walk away and start over? Let us know what you think, and see you in the next one.